Prep as little as you can. Jeremy Crawford, lead rules designer for 5th edition. Dungeons and Dragons. 2. What game system is this book for? This book can work with just about any RPG, particularly D20-based fantasy RPGs. Still, while writing the book, I had 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons clearly in mind. Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master contains no game-specific mechanics, however. The concepts discussed in these chapters can work with just about any fantasy RPG, and will work particularly well with Dungeons and Dragons. Why write a new book? It's been 5 years since the first appearance of Sly Flourish's The Lazy Dungeon Master, and much has changed in those 5 years. Wizards of the Coast published the 5th edition of the Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game in 2014. The streaming of tabletop RPGs online has exploded into a new form of daily entertainment. By any measure, the popularity of Dungeons and Dragons continues to rise. Lots of new people are coming into this amazing hobby. Lots of people who left the hobby are coming back again. The game has changed. We have changed. Even with all this change, though, the ideas in the original Lazy Dungeon Master hold up. People still talk about how that book remains a valuable resource for learning how to prepare less, and to run better role-playing games at the same time. For dungeon masters and other game masters reading the original book today, the ideas found within it work just as well in our current games as they did in our games 5 years ago. Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master is a book designed to help game masters of any type of tabletop role-playing game, both veterans and newcomers alike, get the most value out of the time we spend preparing for our games. The ideas in this book are based on reviews of hundreds of videos, articles, books, and interviews, as well as the shared experiences of thousands of DMs and GMs. Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master begins with an 8-step process for game preparation, then builds on those steps to expand into a full discussion of how we prepare our games, how we run our games, and how we think about our games. Who is this book for? Game masters with some experience running role-playing games will get the most value out of this book. Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master isn't designed to teach beginners how to run role-playing games. Thankfully, many RPG sourcebooks and game master guides can help shepherd new players through the steps of running games for the first time. But you don't need to be a hardened veteran to make use of this book. If you have any amount of experience running RPGs, Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master can help you learn how to get more out of your RPGs by preparing less. About this book 3. So why write this new book? Because we've all learned a lot since then. Though the Lazy Dungeon Master holds up, there are always new ideas to add. We can polish and refine the original concepts with the experience of tens of thousands of game masters to make them even more useful. Though this book builds off the concepts of the original book, Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master is fully self-contained. You don't need to have read The Lazy Dungeon Master before reading this book. If you have previously read the original Lazy Dungeon Master, you'll find familiar ideas here. But this book's way of the Lazy Dungeon Master is a complete revision of the way of the Lazy Dungeon Master presented in that book. Nothing has been copied over directly. Every idea has been re-examined and rewritten in the context of what we know today. This book is a complete encapsulation of the way of the Lazy Dungeon Master. If you want to follow this path, this is the only book you need. How to read this book, Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, is designed to maximize the value of the time you spend reading it. Each chapter is deliberately brief to get you to the meat of the book's topics as fast as possible. Though reading this book from cover to cover offers great benefit, that's not the only way to make use of it. The chapter headings in the table of contents can act as a checklist of the tools, techniques, and principles of the lazy dungeon master. You can skim the table of contents to get an idea of what you already know and what you might want to re-examine. Rereading the table of contents every few months can then help cement the core ideas of the lazy dungeon master in your mind. Chapter 2 explores the lazy dungeon master's checklist that walks you through the main steps of lazy dungeon master preparation. If you read nothing else, read Chapter 2 to gain an understanding of these main steps. The end of each chapter includes a checklist covering the main points of the chapter. Skim these individual chapter checklists to understand what each chapter contains, and whenever you want to review the chapter without having to read the whole thing again, if any of those topics aren't clear, you can dig deeper into the chapter to see what it's talking about. The end of the book contains a list of references and further reading, including books, RPG sourcebooks, articles, and videos for further research into running great games. If you want to dive deeper into becoming a great game master, these references are the best place to start. Read this book in whatever way best suits your needs. If you prefer reading it cover to cover, that's great. If you prefer to skim the contents and pick out the topics that interest you, you'll likewise learn from it. If you find that these ideas resonate with you, you can reread or skim the book regularly to wire its concepts into your own mental GM's toolkit. Like all the ideas in Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, the book itself is meant to be used in whatever way gives you the greatest benefit. Our journey together. The way of the Lazy Dungeon Master isn't doctrine. It's not a set of hard and inflexible rules. This style of running games isn't intended to be the only way to prepare and run our games. Rather, all of us are on a journey together, following the paths of thousands of GMs who have walked before us for more than 40 years. We all seek to find ways to make our role-playing games better. This isn't about anyone grabbing you by the ear and dragging you down a single acceptable path. Instead, each of us has the opportunity to study what we see, discuss it, and determine individually whether a path is the right one or the wrong one for us and our games. Becoming a better game master doesn't result from blindly following rules in a book. It comes from constant and continual improvement of our personal craft. It comes from our continual exploration of this limitless hobby, from finding out what works well for each of us, and from determining what we should discard. Although this book presents a complete checklist for lightweight game preparation with a focus on improvisation at the table, each idea in the book works on its own. You need not follow every step explored here. Rather, adopt the concepts that fit well into your own GM's toolkit or preparation process. Take the parts of this book that work well for you and omit those that do not. Let's begin our journey together. Preparing for your game. Prepare what benefits your game. Those 5 words represent the core philosophy of the Lazy Dungeon Master. Our goal is to learn what parts of our RPG preparation and execution bring the most fun to our games. Our goal is to understand what benefits our games and to separate that from what offers little value for the energy we spend in preparation. The way of the Lazy Dungeon Master, first stated 5 years ago in The Lazy Dungeon Master, begins with a simple initial idea. We can spend less time preparing for our RPGs and still run great games. In that earlier book, I hypothesized that all of us as GMs spend a lot of time preparing things for our games that offer little actual value to the players. So by boiling our preparation down to only the things that matter the most, we can save considerable time. While exploring this idea, however, I found another potentially deeper hypothesis. The less we prepare, the better our games will be. Now this seems like something that can't possibly work. How is it even feasible that the less we put into our games before we run them, the more fun we'll have with our players at the table? But indeed, The Way of the Lazy Dungeon Master. Chapter 1. Many game masters, including many GMs we might think of as experts and professionals within the hobby, have found this to be true. The less we prepare, the better our games will be. Clearly, though, this idea works only up to a point. We can't take this notion to its mathematical conclusion of prepare nothing and your game will be infinitely more fun. Some GMs do state that they prepare nothing at all for their games, but those GMs are a small minority. The 2016 Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master Survey, conducted at slyflourish.com, received responses from 6,600 5th edition Dungeon Masters, only 2% of whom said that they spent no time at all preparing for their games. This means that roughly 98% of us seem to agree that some game preparation is required to run a great game. Certainly, there is a point at which too little preparation can harm the fun of a game. Though we can often prepare less than we think we need to before a game, we must prepare something. And because all GMs are different, what we need to prepare to run an RPG session varies. Yet many of us instinctively cluster around a few key preparation steps that can help us prepare less and still run great games. Instinctively, each of us develops our own individual list of preparation activities by looking at every step we typically take and every technique we use while actually running a game. Then we ask ourselves, is this really useful? Is this really fun? And does it bring enough joy to the game to be worth the effort? Each step and each component is worth drawing out under the cold, harsh light of reality so that we can examine it dispassionately. Let's look again at our lazy dungeon master mantra, prepare what benefits your game. It's easy to see that this simple statement has a negative space. In thinking about what best benefits our games, we can also think about what does not benefit our games, and we can ask whether those things might best be discarded. If we extend our mantra into describing this negative space, we have the following: prepare what benefits your game and omit what does not. This second part of the process can be hard. As GMs, we're all so rooted to the ways we've always done things that it's often difficult to let those ways go. We don't have to make a big plunge into abandoning what we've always done, though. Instead, we can run small experiments. We can try things out. We don't have to throw away $5,000 worth of miniatures to try running combat in the theater of the mind once or twice. We don't have to get rid of 500 pounds of 3D terrain to try out the flexibility of a single blank poster map for a couple of sessions. We don't have to toss out a 3-ring binder holding hundreds of pages of world building to try out some spiral campaign development. Trying out a new idea or removing a preparation step we typically take doesn't mean we have to do so forever. We just might give it a try for a game or two and see how it feels. For some game masters, time is such a limited commodity that the question of what to throw away isn't the problem. Some GMs just don't have the time for a lot of game preparation, even to the point where a lack of time prevents some would-be GMs from running games at all. Hopefully this book can help, because preparing for a game requires less time than you might think. Using the game preparation checklist in this book takes about 15 to 30 minutes for a 4-hour game. So whether you're just looking for ways to refine your own game preparation or seeking a system that saves you time, this book hopefully has a few ideas that might resonate. Let's dig in. The Lazy Dungeon Master's Checklist. What does the way of the lazy dungeon master look like? What are the steps we can take to prepare our games in as little time as possible and still run a great RPG? For a typical game session, the Lazy Dungeon Master's checklist looks like this. Review the characters, create a strong start, outline potential scenes, define secrets and clues, develop fantastic locations, outline important NPCs, choose relevant monsters, Select magic item rewards. That's it. A number of variables will make some of these steps grow or shrink, including the length of our session, where a session falls within the campaign, and whether we're running a published adventure or not. We might even skip a few of these steps if we know we don't need them. If we're starting a brand new campaign, we might have some extra steps, covered later on in the book. But even for brand new games, this checklist keeps us focused on what matters at the table. Here's a brief summary of each of the steps. The chapters that follow then break out each step in detail and offer examples to show what using the checklist looks like. Review the characters. Before we do anything else, it helps to spend a few minutes reviewing the player characters. What are their names? What do they want? What plays into their backgrounds? What do the players of these characters enjoy at the table? You might not even write anything down during this step, but reviewing the characters helps wire them into your mind and ensures that the rest of your preparation fits around them. Create a strong start. How a game starts is likely the most important piece of preparation we can do. Setting the stage for the session determines a great deal about how the rest of the game will go. When you define where a game session starts, you figure out what's going on, what the initial focus of the session is, and how you can get close to the action. When in doubt, start with a fight. Outline potential scenes. With a strong start in hand, we can then outline a short list of potential scenes that might unfold. This step exists mostly to make you feel as though you have a handle on the game before you start. However, as GMs, all of us must always be ready to throw our potential scenes away when the game goes in a different direction, as it often does. Usually, it's enough to come up with only a few words per scene and to expect 1 or 2 scenes per hour of play. At other times, you might skip this step completely if you don't think you need it. Define secrets and clues. The next step is second only in importance to the strong start, and is one of the most powerful tools available to the lazy dungeon master. Secrets and clues are single short sentences that describe a clue, a piece of the story, or a piece of the world that the characters can discover during the game. You don't know exactly how the characters will discover these clues. As such, you'll want to keep these secrets and clues abstract from their place of discovery, so that you can drop them into the game wherever it makes sense. This lets the game flow freely, while still allowing you to reveal important pieces of the story at any point where the characters might discover them. During this step, you might write down 10 such secrets or clues. Develop fantastic locations. Building evocative locations isn't easily improvised. As such, it's worth spending time writing out a handful of fantastic locations that the characters might discover and explore during the game. Each location can be thought of as a set, a room, or a backdrop for a single scene in your adventure. Describe each location with a short evocative title, such as the Sunspire. Then write down 3 fantastic aspects for it, along the lines of blazing beam of light shining to the heavens, moat of molten rock, or huge elven glyphs carved into ancient stone. Ultimately, whole dungeons can be built from a series of connected fantastic locations, with each location representing a large area or chamber. A specific location might not come up during the game for which you prepare it, but it will be ready for a later session as the characters explore. Outline important NPCs. During our preparation, we'll outline those NPCs, non-player characters, most critical to the adventure, focusing on a name and a connection to the adventure, then wrapping the NPC in a character archetype from popular fiction. Many other NPCs, maybe even most of them, can be improvised right at the table. Choose relevant monsters. What monsters are the characters most likely to face? What monsters make sense for a specific location and situation? We're using the term monster loosely here, so as to include enemy NPCs as well as truly monstrous foes. Whatever type of enemy you need, reading through books of monsters can give you the fuel to choose the right creatures for the right situation. Additionally, understanding the loose relationship between monster challenge rating and character level can help you understand how a battle might go. Most of the time, you can just list a number of monsters and improvise encounters based on what's happening in the adventure. For boss battles, you might have to do more work. Select magic item rewards. Players love magic items, and it's worthwhile to spend time preparing items they'll find interesting. This step also helps to directly impact the characters by dropping an interesting part of the story literally into their hands. You can use a mixture of techniques to reward magic items, from selecting items randomly to selecting specific items based on the themes of the characters and the desires of the players. Magic items are also a great mechanism for delivering secrets and clues. A loose outline to get comfortable. Your actual use of this checklist might change from game to game, but reviewing the checklist each time you begin to prepare for your game can help you feel comfortable that you're focusing your energy on the activities that provide the most value. The more comfortable you become improvising your games, the more you might start skipping certain steps on the list. All that's important is that you don't want your confidence to lead you away from important steps that your players enjoy. The Lazy Dungeon Masters Published Adventures Checklist. Our Lazy Dungeon Masters Checklist works whether we're running a published adventure or our own home-brewed adventures. But published adventures offer tremendous value to the Lazy Dungeon Master, whether you play them mostly as written or use them to inspire your own ideas, giving you published and play-tested material you can drop into your own adventures. To get the most out of a published adventure, it's important to first read the adventure, absorbing it and letting it inspire you. You then need to make the adventure your own by customizing it for your group. Adventure writers both expect and hope that GMs will run their adventures in whatever way best suits our games. When running a published adventure and going over the Lazy Dungeon Masters checklist, you might find that some of the steps are done for you. You might not need to put as much energy into steps like building fantastic locations, identifying NPCs, choosing monsters, or selecting magic items. Still, because you always want to customize the adventure, it's worth reviewing the checklist when running a published adventure to help you sort through and focus all the material that the adventure is providing. The Lazy Dungeon Master and online play. Running RPGs online has grown significantly in the past few years. In the 2016 Dungeon Master Survey at slyflourish.com, roughly 20% of surveyed DMs said they primarily run their D&D games online. Although Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master doesn't specifically address online play, the steps and processes discussed in the book work just as well, whether you interact with your players online or around the table. Running online games might require additional steps or tactics, particularly in learning how to use the tools of your favorite virtual tabletop. In other ways, though, a virtual tabletop can make life as a GM even easier. However you play, the Lazy Dungeon Master's checklist still works. An ongoing example: the Scourge of Volixus. Throughout this book, we're going to talk about a single example adventure called the Scourge of Volixus. You'll see how to approach and make use of each step of the Lazy Dungeon Master's checklist as it's applied to the adventure, culminating by the end of the book in an adventure outline suitable for play. The Lazy Dungeon Master's Published Adventures Checklist. Our Lazy Dungeon Master's Checklist works whether we're running a published adventure or our own home-brewed adventures. But published adventures offer tremendous value to the lazy dungeon master, whether you play them mostly as written or use them to inspire your own ideas, giving you published and play-tested material you can drop into your own adventures. To get the most out of a published adventure, it's important to first read the adventure, absorbing it and letting it inspire you. You then need to make the adventure your own by customizing it for your group. Adventure writers both expect and hope that GMs will run their adventures in whatever way best suits our games. When running a published adventure and going over the Lazy Dungeon Masters checklist, you might find that some of the steps are done for you. You might not need to put as much energy into steps like building fantastic locations, identifying NPCs, choosing monsters, or selecting magic items. Still, because you always want to customize the adventure, it's worth reviewing the checklist when running a published adventure to help you sort through and focus all the material that the adventure is providing. The Lazy Dungeon Master and online play. Running RPGs online has grown significantly in the past few years. In the 2016 Dungeon Master Survey at slyflourish.com, roughly 20% of surveyed DMs said they primarily run their D&D games online. Although Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master doesn't specifically address online play, the steps and processes discussed in the book work just as well, whether you interact with your players online or around the table. Running online games might require additional steps or tactics, particularly in learning how to use the tools of your favorite virtual tabletop. In other ways, though, a virtual tabletop can make life as a GM even easier. However you play, the Lazy Dungeon Master's checklist still works. An ongoing example: the Scourge of Volixus. Throughout this book, we're going to talk about a single example adventure called the Scourge of Volixus. You'll see how to approach and make use of each step of the Lazy Dungeon Master's checklist as it's applied to the adventure, culminating by the end of the book in an adventure outline suitable for play. However you choose to do it, write down the names, backgrounds, motivations, and desires of the characters. Then review them before you begin to prepare the rest of your game. Can you remember their names? There's a simple test every GM can conduct to see if we really are keeping the characters firmly in mind. Can we remember each of their names? Usually, a name is enough to remind you about the rest of the character when you call it up. If you don't remember the characters' names instinctively, spend some time doing so, and you'll find that remembering their backgrounds and motivations easily follows. Checklist for reviewing the characters. Write down the names, backgrounds, and motivations of all the characters. Review these character notes to prime your mind before the rest of your preparation. Use this character review to help you tie the characters to the rest of your game. Test yourself to see if you can remember the names of the characters. Enough to cut it. Create a strong start. Chapter 4. You want to take a little bit of time to think it through, and you can use a few questions to aim in the right direction. What's happening? What's the point? Where's the action? What's happening? The world of your game lives and breathes. Things happen outside the view of the characters, or at least that's what you want the players to believe. You can reinforce this belief by framing the start of your game session with an event of some sort, but one that doesn't necessarily connect to the characters or their actions. Perhaps a huge storm is hammering the ship the characters are traveling aboard. Maybe they stumble across a group of moon worshippers on the night of a lunar eclipse. Or maybe they've wandered into town on the day of the prince's wedding to a rival baron's daughter. Not every session needs to start with a big external event of this sort. but such an event can bring life and texture to the otherwise static world surrounding the local quest giver at the tavern. With the characters firmly in mind, we can now look at the most important question for preparing our next game session. How will it begin? This is the only point in the game where a game master has nearly complete control. No one has acted yet. No character has cut the throat of the primary quest-giving NPC. No one has robbed the Baron's messenger before the party could be hired to find his idiot son in the forgotten cellars beneath the castle. To understand where your game starts, you need only to write down a single sentence that clarifies how your session will begin. That said, specificity is better than generality. The Baron talks to the characters about saving his idiot son isn't all that evocative, so instead go with something like, during the autumn festival of the running of the pigs, the Baron's foppish messenger, Louis Van Dorf, approaches the characters commanding them to an audience with Baron Winthrone, just before being run over by the dire boar Bloodtusk. Okay, maybe that's a bit much, but you get the idea. With the sentence describing how your game begins, you want to paint a picture for the players, one that lives and breathes and gets the session moving. Your first general idea probably isn't specific. Getting over that first hump, going from just a bunch of people sitting around a table to playing D&D, is, for me, the hardest thing to do. Matthew Cole. Here are 10 example events that can start a game session off in a memorable way. Local townsfolk are celebrating the annual running of the pigs. It's the day of a wedding between two members of rival hostile families. The local lending house has just been robbed. A rough mercenary army unexpectedly rolls into town. A clearly unnatural storm of swirling violet clouds tears across the local landscape. Everyone is preparing for the annual Feeding of the Rock. It's Boxing Day, and the lords of the area are all serving drinks to the local farmers. The city magistrate has just outlawed alcohol. The king is dead. It's been raining for a solid month, and the bad weather has no end in sight. What's the point? The start of your game session should be the kick that sends the characters off to do something. You should have a clear point and purpose for the start of your session. Most often, this is the main seed or hook that sends the characters off on the next stage of their adventures. Characters might find the bloody sigil of an assassin's guild marking the hair-covered palms of their were-rat assailants. They might witness thugs harassing a local apothecary, demanding that she give them all the sulphur she has. 6 suits of animated armor could wander into the town square, demanding to do battle with a queen long dead, and promising that an army of their kind will slaughter every living thing within 100 miles if they are denied. Each starting scene contains the hook required to pull the characters into that stage of the adventure. Then the players decide how the characters will respond to that hook. Where's the action? There's a term for a style of writing stories called in medias res, Latin for into the middle of things. This technique brings the viewer into the story in the most immediate way, avoiding setup and jumping in as close as possible to dramatic action. Think of the opening sequences of the many James Bond movies. Car chases, ski chases, foot chases, lots of shooting, and things blowing up. There's a reason that action movies in particular use this technique. It works. Those movies get you as close to the action as they can right away. The opening scenes of your game sessions can do the same thing. Instead of starting with heavy narrative and description, plodding along as the characters wander about looking for something to do, you can start as close to the action as possible. A thief tries to steal the coin purse of one of the party members, An eclipse begins to darken the sun, and a dozen normally well-adjusted villagers draw knives and begin to attack one another. Something explodes. It's always tempting to start a game session with setting, locations, and a discussion of large events. All GMs love to paint the big picture. But by skipping all that, you can get right into the heart of the adventure. So how do you go about starting close to the action? Start with combat. No matter what your favorite fantasy RPG, its key components are invariably exploration, social interaction, and combat. Of these components, combat embodies action. Combat is so ferocious that the game needs to focus time down to 6-second rounds. So if you ever want to get the attention of the players, there's no easier way than to throw the characters into a fight. Starting an adventure session with combat has many advantages. It gets the players rolling dice right away. It brings everyone's attention to the table. It forces all of us as GMs to break past our desire to spew 20 minutes of deep narrative. And best of all, a battle almost always comes with its own built-in story hooks. Who are these strange, blood-faced rat folk, and why are they so brash as to attack by daylight? Why are the townsfolk murdering each other during the solar eclipse? Where the hell did that wyvern come from, and how did it know to attack that one specific noble? In the process of the characters seeking answers to these questions during and after the first combat, the hooks for the session are set up. This technique can be easily overused, of course. It's an easy trick that won't work every single time. You can always think of other ways to get the characters close to the action without throwing them into a fight. It's only really important that something happens at the start of your session. Still, 25 James Bond movies have used the same opening pattern since 1962. That might make it good enough for you to use too. When in doubt, start with combat. 10 examples of a strong start. Now that you have a relatively simple formula for building a starting scene, you can write down the start of a session in a single sentence or short paragraph, building a rich opener to your game. So, what do these strong starts really look like? Let's check out 10 examples. During the ceremony marking the marriage of the prince to the daughter of an ambitious baron, a wyvern wearing a glyph-marked collar sweeps down from the mountains and attacks the father of the bride. During the annual festival of flowers, the floor of the old Dudley barn turned dance hall collapses, revealing ancient vaults filled with angry skeletons wearing armor from the age of 3 sons. During the running of the pigs, a huge dire boar suddenly appears, roaring through the village and shredding local folk with steel-coated tusks. A band of blood-faced were-rats launches an attack on the opening day of the autumn market. Their leader clutches a note with sketches of the player characters and a cryptic message, "Their lives or yours." During a once-in-a-lifetime solar eclipse, just as the moon crosses the sun, dozens of villagers draw blades and begin to attack their unsuspecting neighbors. 10 suits of animated armor of a style not seen for 1,000 years interrupt the local lord's address and issue a challenge to a queen long dead. Goblins riding dire wolves attack a group of over 100 refugees from the neighboring town of Gladeswallow. On the opening day of the fishing season in the lakeside town of Windsor, the frost giant Godrum Icerift smashes down the walled town's guard towers. He demands a tribute of 100 barrels of fish per month, or he will destroy the entire settlement. On the day of her husband's death, Queen Vanris is revealed to be the red dragon Vanris Whitefire, then declares herself the 1,000-year queen of the realm. Her hobgoblin army marches through the open gates of the capital and promptly takes over as the city's new guard. On the coldest day of the year, the innkeeper of the Blackhorn Inn shakily declares that he has long been the pawn of a terrible being lurking in the ancient cellars below the inn. Before anyone can respond, his left eye fills with blood and he drops dead. Then 4 long-time patrons of the inn rise up, reveal their true twisted forms, and begin to slaughter all those around them.
You'll notice that each of these examples follows the same basic formula. Each is framed by some event, each has a clear hook to a larger story, and each gets the characters into the action, and often directly into combat. Strong starts in the middle of adventures. The examples above show how you can start an adventure as the story begins. But much of the time you'll be starting off a gaming session in the middle of an adventure. A clean break between sessions might happen occasionally, but it's much more common to start a session in the middle of a story. As such, it might seem that you don't need to worry about where the game will start, if you already know where it ended. The need for a strong start for the session still stands. Even when you're in the middle of a story, you can spend some time figuring out how to get the next session started strong. You can inject a new event, a change in the weather perhaps, or an alarm suddenly raised that hadn't been heard before. Even when you're in the middle of the adventure, a strong start gets a game session off on the right foot. A strong start for the Scourge of Velixus. As the initial focal point for our Scourge of Velixus example adventure, we can use the following strong start. During the last great trade day before winter falls upon the village of White Sparrow, an iron-armored caravan filled with hooded hobgoblins attacks the bazaar. Their goal is to steal weapons and armor, as well as an old book possessed by Paula Dustyfingers, the curio vendor. That gets things started nicely, with a strong battle and lots of interesting hooks for the characters to investigate. Checklist for creating a strong start. What's happening? What event will frame the start of this section of the adventure? What's the point? What seed or hook will lead the characters further into the adventure? Where's the action? Start as close to the action as you can. When in doubt, start with combat.